Hello and welcome to lecture number 18. This is topic 2.7, Slavery and American Law, Slave Codes and Landmark Cases. The first learning objective is to explain how American law affected the lives and citizenship rights of enslaved and free Americans between the 17th and 19th centuries. We'll start with how slavery shows up in the U.S. Constitution, drafted in 1787 and adopted in 1788. The Constitution avoids using the words slave or slavery, even though they appear in earlier drafts. Instead, it uses euphemisms to refer to those who are enslaved. These protections were written into the Constitution to secure ratification by Southern states where slavery was foundational to their economic system. Therefore, Northern states needed to give some concessions and protections regarding slavery. There are three main instances where slavery appears in the Constitution. Two of them are in Article 1. The first is the delay in ending the international slave trade, allowing 20 more years of importing enslaved people in the United States before it could be banned in 1808. During these 20 years, more than 200,000 enslaved people were imported into the United States. The second part in Article 1 is a 3/5 clause, a result of the 3/5 Compromise during the Constitutional Convention. It governs the representation of states in the House of Representatives and allocates electoral votes in the Electoral College. This clause states that enslaved people are to be counted as 3/5 of a person for determining a state's representation in Congress. James Madison, often called the father of the Constitution, played a crucial role in drafting these compromises to appease both northern and southern states. Slave states wanted to increase this number as much as possible to gain disproportionate representation in Congress. However, they feared that this counting might result in the federal government levying a head tax based on the number of people in each state. Northern states wanted enslaved people to count as a full person for tax purposes. Eventually, the two sides agreed on the 3/5 formula, which was used for both representation and potential head taxes. This compromise became more beneficial to southern slave states because such a head tax was never actually implemented. The last place where slavery appears is in Article 4, in the form of the Fugitive Slave Clause. This clause guarantees the return of human property that escapes the states where slavery is not sanctioned. The first time this part of the Constitution was enforced was through the 1793 Fugitive Slave Act. Subsequent Fugitive Slave Acts were passed, each more harsh than the last. The final and most severe act passed as part of the Compromise of 1850. It forced Northern citizens and residents to aid in the recovery of runaway enslaved people, lest they face legal action against them. The 1850 Fugitive Slave Act also denied alleged fugitives the right to a jury trial and increased penalties for those who aided escapees. The first time the word slavery actually appears in the Constitution is in the 13th Amendment, ratified in 1865. This amendment formally abolishes slavery and involuntary servitude, except as punishment for duly convicted crimes. This amendment was passed by Congress on January 31st, 1865, and ratified by the states on December 6, 1865. Even before the Constitution, the British North American colonies and later the United States that practiced slavery had laws governing the rights of enslaved people. These laws were first seen in the British Empire on the island of Barbados in 1661. By 1667, Virginia had adopted individual laws, but South Carolina was the first to pass a full set of slave codes in 1691. They drew from both the Barbados and Jamaican slave codes. However, the Barbados Slave Code of 1661 influenced many of these laws, setting a precedent for brutal control measures. Slave codes in the United States, as in the Caribbean, define chattel slavery as race-based, inheritable, and a lifelong condition. This differed from previous forms of slavery, which were not limited to a specific race, were not inheritable, and were not always lifelong. The English viewed Africans as inferior and believed their natural disposition was that of servitude to white Europeans. Thomas Jefferson's writings and notes on the state of Virginia reflect this belief in the inherent inferiority of Africans. The new portion of the law that made slavery inheritable through the mother's line was contrary to the legal tradition governing inheritance. Making the institution lifelong was also contrary to labor practices in the colonies up to that point. Indentured servants sold themselves into servitude for a set number of years with a set amount of pay and an eventual end date. Chattel slavery had no endpoint, and later, the ability to purchase freedom or be manumitted became severely limited. Slave codes also restricted the movement of enslaved people, their congregation, possession of weapons, and even down to the clothing they wore, forbidding fine fabrics. Other colonizers in the Americas that practiced slavery also passed their versions of slave codes. In French Louisiana, they had the Code Noir, which regulated the lives of enslaved people. For example, if an enslaved person ran away 3 times, they were subject to capital punishment. They also tried to restrict the freedom of free blacks, but these laws were difficult to enforce due to the frontier conditions of the territory. The Code Noir of 1685, established by King Louis XIV, included provisions for the religious instruction of slaves and prohibited their mistreatment, though enforcement was lax. In the Spanish colonies, they had the Código Negro, which was somewhat more lenient, maintaining provisions for the purchase of freedom. This actually bolstered the institution of slavery in the Spanish Empire because there were fewer instances of revolt due to greater opportunities for freedom. One impact of slave codes was that they hardened the color line in American society, reserving opportunities for upward mobility to white people and assuming the natural condition of black people was servitude. White people who sold their labor like indentured servants had the opportunity to be free after their contract ended, while black people had perpetual enslavement. Slave codes also protected white people from enslavement based on their race, whereas previous protections were based on adherence to Christianity. As slave codes became harsher, they denied blacks the opportunity to gain freedom through conversion, which was no longer grounds for manumission. The Virginia Slave Codes of 1705 further institutionalized these racial distinctions, legally establishing the perpetual servitude of Africans and their descendants. In the early Republic, or the period in the early 1800s, Enlightenment thought and egalitarian values started to fade. Northern states that had done away with slavery began to deny free African American opportunities for advancement. Some states entirely barred the entry of free blacks into their territory, such as most of the Northwest Territory organized under the Northwest Ordinance. They instituted restrictions to keep free black men from voting or testifying against white people in court. Some free black men had the right to vote in states like Pennsylvania and Massachusetts, but this right was slowly taken away in the 1820s. The era, commonly known as the Age of the Common Man, saw property requirements across various states being removed to increase the overall voting eligible populations. Simultaneously, these states put in place race requirements, so white men without property gained the right to vote, while black men with property lost their right to vote. Finally, the 15th Amendment in 1870 granted this rights to all men nationwide. The 15th Amendment was ratified on February 3, 1870, and it aimed to protect the voting rights of African American men. This was the beginning of an era of segregation and the start of Jim Crow. Jim Crow was a minstrel show character played by a white actor in blackface who acted in an exaggerated, buffoonish way, creating a negative stereotype of intelligence and abilities of black people. In the 19th century, all the separate accommodations created were referred to as Jim Crow accommodations, meaning that they were for black people. The first instance in the use of Jim Crow was for train cars in Massachusetts before the Civil War. The Supreme Court case Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896 upheld these separate accommodations under the separate but equal doctrine. Finally, note that the College Board and exam description has an essential knowledge point stating that Wisconsin and Iowa had given black men the right to vote before the Civil War. However, all I could find on this was that it was granted to them by the courts just before the Civil War began. The franchise was more prevalent in other northern states before the Civil War, and states like Wisconsin and Iowa had actually put in more restrictive laws against free blacks during that time period. The second learning objective is to explain how slave codes developed in response to African American resistance to slavery. Slave codes were frequently revised in response to forms of resistance. The Stoner Rebellion is one of the most visible examples from the 18th century. It was the largest slave uprising in the British mainland colonies, prompting widespread fear among white colonists. It started in South Carolina outside the city of Charleston, where enslaved people killed about 30 white people with the intent to escape to Spanish Florida, where they would have been granted freedom. The fear of more revolts led to stricter slave codes, especially in areas with larger enslaved populations. The Stoner Rebellion inspired the 1740 South Carolina Negro Act, which cited the rebellion as the reason for these new restrictions on black and enslaved people. The new South Carolina Slave Code presumed that all black people were enslaved and that any indigenous community that didn't comply with the policing of enslaved people could also be treated as enslaved as well. Some of the things that the new slave code prohibited was growing their own food, gathering, drumming, learning to read, rebelling, running away, and moving abroad to other colonial territories. It also allowed enslavers to kill rebellious blacks without a trial and to police the movement of enslaved people using slave patrols. Slave patrols were groups of armed men who monitored and enforced discipline on plantations. It also condemned to death any enslaved person who tried to defend themselves from an attack by a white person. You can see that not only were black enslaved people being further limited in their freedoms, but they were also being treated much more as expendable than as human beings. The major Supreme Court case that defined the citizenship rights and protections of black and enslaved people in the 19th century was Scott v. Sanford in 1857. It revolved around the case of Dred Scott and his wife Harriet, who sued for their freedom based on being taken into free territory by their former enslaver. They claimed that by having crossed over into territory that did not sanction slavery, they were in turn free. The court decision, which came right before the Civil War and in fact increased tensions between North and South so much that it could be seen as a cause for the Civil War, said that Scott was not entitled to sue based on his lack of citizenship. The decision was written by Chief Justice Roger B. Taney. He said that the framers of the government never intended for black or enslaved people to have such rights. He pronounced that enslaved people were legally protected property, and because the government could not deny the right of property to people or take it away without due process, all previous laws that forbade slavery anywhere would be unconstitutional. The law in question here was the one set up by the Missouri Compromise, which said that the states north of Missouri's southern boundary could not practice slavery. This was now unenforceable, and so slavery could be legal everywhere across the United States. The Dred Scott decision also invalidated the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which allowed territories to decide on the legality of slavery through popular sovereignty. All right, and finally for the recap, slavery's presence in the Constitution goes back to the Constitutional Convention. Slave codes were adopted to control the lives of the enslaved. Slave codes hardened the color line, and free states had their own laws regulating the freedom of black people. Slave codes were hardened after insurrections, and finally, the Dred Scott case denied citizenship to all African Americans. Thank you for watching. If you would like to watch the next lecture, click the thumbnail on the screen. And if you would like more resources to help you study, you can visit apushslides.com/afam. I wish you the best of luck with your studies, and I hope to see you back on the next lecture.